I'd like to thank you all for coming to a little presentation, a digital discussion on John Burroughs' American Naturalist. John Burroughs was born on April 3rd, 1837 in Roxbury, New York. Actually, a photo of Roxbury right here on the Burroughs family farm. The family had been here for generations on a 300-acre farm by the time John was born, and he was the seventh of 10 children. And his father was Chauncey, and his mother was Amy. Chauncey only had two loves in life, politics and religion, so the most that John read in the household was the Bible. But Amy did love nature and something she actually taught John about to love the outdoors and appreciate what you have. And for income, they did grow their own food, but sales mainly, or income, came from sales of butter, about 2 tons a year. And these trips selling the butter was actually John's first chance to go to the outdoors or going outside the family farm and exploring the world. And for schooling, from the ages of 5 to 10, he went to the Old Stone Jug House. This is what he called it, a one-story, one-room schoolhouse near the area. And thing is, though, for schooling back then, at least for on the farm, he went to school during fall, winter, and spring. But during the summer, he went back home to work on the family farm. As by the age of 5, you're working. Now, John, in his schooling, he did love writing, he did love reading and recess, but nothing much else. Didn't really like to, in a sense, work. He would rather spend time outside looking at the bugs, the birds, and the bees. Now, he did, at the age of 10, go to the West Settlement School, get a further education, and graduated at the age of 16 with a passion for reading and also a passion for teaching. Now, this is a photo of a school in the 1880s, 1890s, and John Burroughs is not photoed right here. He's not shown. The thing is, though, he left the nest at 17, the first member of the Burroughs family to actually leave the farm to go teaching. He went to teach at Tongor, New York, about 30 miles from Roxbury, and was paid about $11 a month. Teaching, though, was pretty strange back then by nowadays standard, as the pay wasn't enough to simply actually find housing, that he would actually go and spend, I would say, have an abode or stay at the students' houses, as the parents would simply rotate who gets to like have John in their house for the week. But still worked out in the end. His students did love him despite his young age, but he was seen as gentle, understanding, and kind, able to relate to the students, and got some pretty good comments from the parents also. Now, the thing is, though, this money would last him only so much. He did attend one term at the Literary Institute in Ashland, New York. He did learn English literature, French, Latin, chemistry, and math. The thing is, though, he was not paid enough to attend more schooling, so he would go back to teaching and working on the family farm. And in 1856, he did attend Cooperstown Seminary, a college prep school, and he also published his first work there, an article in the newspaper. So now he's technically an author. Thing is, though, as far as his schooling went, he never actually went to college and got a degree. Did get honorary degrees later on, but nothing during his youth. And his time away from the family actually helped him expand his view on the world. In New York, he'd actually go to different bookstores and actually read other texts beside the Bible. But also, he learned during the time he was actually handsome, and he actually find someone to love, someone to marry. And he would find that later on with his future wife. Yeah. On to Ursula North Burroughs. Now, Ursula, she was John's senior, about 13 months. Actually met while John was teaching and being housed by families of students. They were engaged in April of 1856 after 8 months of dating. And the thing is, though, there was already some tension growing just because Ursula looked down upon John's writing, thought it was not a suitable career, would not make enough money, as Ursula's family was pretty well off. And throughout their life, they would suffer, not so much impoverished, but not a lot of the nicer things in life. But they did get married in on September 12th, 1857. But John's family did not attend the marriage, did not attend the wedding. They disapproved of it just because they thought John was too young and had simply not seen enough of the world. So John's family not really in the picture per se. But he would later on go back to his family to work, as even though they got married, they could not live together for a number of years. They could not simply afford their own housing, so go back to their own family farms, their family homes. And there was a little issue for John, as John Burroughs in his letters to his friends at the time would describe how beautiful Ursula was, and this photo right here is from 1863. Thing is, though, they never said anything about how her personality, her education, just simply how she looked physically. which his friends had a little bit of an issue with, but was still, it'd come up later on. Now, it was only in 1858 they got housing together at High Falls, and in 1859, actually in West Orange, where John taught for $50 a month. The thing is, though, did not include housing, so it's barely making ends meet. And Ursula still despaired over his meager income, and also at this time, John was cheating on his wife. It happened throughout the relationship, a real shame, and later on I'll get to more detail about. But things are changing for John now. In November 1860, he sold Expressions, an essay he wrote to the Atlantic Monthly. He got some big praise, boosted up his confidence, thing as though not a lot of money. He did try anything to appease his wife. He tried to study medicine. He did so for about a month, then gave up. He started his study of botany, which would play into his writings, but never so much a career. And he did do temporary teaching work and farm labor to make ends meet. He was always welcome back at the farm to go work. Now, this is actually a picture of Washington, D.C., the Treasury Building in 1863. And I have this photo because John Burroughs and his wife are looking for somewhere to live and also a better job, a better chance in life. Now, John Burroughs' friends, such as Walt Whitman, actually approached John about going to Washington, D.C. to work. The thing is, though, it is wartime. John Burroughs never served her officially, never enlisted into the military. The thing is, though, there's conflict in the area, and business is booming are in terms of supporting the war industry, not so much for writing. So John Burroughs did apply to actually be a quartermaster aide, which I believe was in January of 1864. Only lasted about a month, then he got fired, so shame in that. But did eventually get a job at the Treasury Department as a clerk, and it got him about $1,200 a year, which was big money, and also a chance to rent on Capitol Hill, actually have a home, a land, and also some animals to take care of. And this job would last until 1885, working for the Treasury Department. Now, I said he didn't serve or didn't enlist, but he did fight as the Treasury Department. All the clerks and accountants were organized into a volunteer unit. So a couple days out of the week, could actually train in uniform and with a gun, a firearm. And John did see combat for 2 days because the Confederate Army got within 7 miles of Washington, D.C. He got deployed and put to the trenches. He never fired a shot, and his fellow soldiers did make fun of him for simply ducking and diving when the bullets were whizzing over his head. I don't blame him for ducking and diving. But he would later on throughout his life actually regret not serving in the military, as John Burroughs was an abolitionist and did support the Union cause. Now, Walt Whitman, I mentioned him earlier. He was actually an American poet, an inspiration for John Burroughs, and also a really good friend later on. And also the focus of John's first book, Notes on Walt Whitman as Poet in Person in 1867. This book sold very poorly, as it simply, as John would recognize later on, it was not so much his work, his writing, it was more so Whitman's, was not transformative enough, wasn't his own book. But Walt Whitman did have some good sides. The fact is he did defend Ursula, as John Burroughs would complain in letters to Walt and also conversations that Ursula was frigid. And Walt would say that, John, you're not spending time with her. You don't love her enough. And Walt Whitman also did have a nice side to him. The fact is he was always broke, not because he had a poor job. It was just because any money he'd make, he'd actually give to Union soldiers in the hospital to cheer him up, and actually would have to live in dank apartments and basements just to find housing. It's all he could afford. And later on, would actually move into the Burroughs home. As Ursula was alone, it was pretty hard for her to make friends, and the house was big, it was lonely, and at least somebody could come over and meet her. Walt Whitman was one of the few friends that Ursula liked, as the rest she saw as dirty, and also they were writers, which she never appreciated as a career. And the bottom of the PowerPoint, it is true that Walt Whitman did have a stroke, and Ursula would actually take care of him, and also John's pet trout, which is kind of strange saying that, but multiple letters at the time said, Ursula, take care of the trout, don't let it die. Even told Whitman to keep an eye on it. Now to move on to Wake Robin is actually John Burroughs' second book, a collection of essays he actually wrote on American flora and fauna. And this was in 1871 and was a huge success. Americans loved it because America at the time is changing in terms of industrialization. A lot of people going from farming to working in the factories. And John Burroughs' writing, which would help boost his career later on, was very simple, easy to comprehend, easy to read, and some could criticize a bit of a romanticized view of nature. The thing is, though, people loved it, a nice view in history, and also a way to appreciate nature. Now, he did, though, with getting his new book out, he did quit his job on December 31st, 1872. He would quit his job to become a federal bank examiner and would travel all across Virginia and New York to examine banks. Ursula, though, was left alone at the time, only with Walt, who did have a stroke, was not really good conversation. And also, John's pet trout was still there. Now, this is a photo, if you look behind John, of Riverby. This home was built, will start in 1873 on 9 acres of land west of the Hudson River, bought by John, and in 1874 it was finished. Riverby was built to blend into the background, into the countryside in a sense, and John did help design all of the home. The issue is, though, that Ursula never played a part in designing it. She was never asked, not even asked about the name. And it was only in 1874, once the home was completed, that John brought her over and said, "This is our new home, a place we can share together." But there's a little predicament, as this home has some issues, as John didn't really think things through. On the outside, it looked pretty nice, but indoors, there were barely any windows, and those windows were pretty small, so not enough light. The home was perpetually dark. The kitchen and dining room were in the basement on the bottom floor, and this is a 3-story building. So Ursula to actually mop the floors, as Ursula did was a cleanly person. John Burroughs, though, was not. He was, I wouldn't say he's dirty, but he didn't wash up now and then. That Ursula would have to carry a bucket of water up multiple flights of stairs, and also meant they actually bought a portable bathtub so they could bathe themselves on separate floors and not in the basement. And the heating was so poor, they actually had to leave during the winter so they didn't freeze to death. It was that bad. John didn't really think things through. But the first visitor to Riverby was Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, bit of a tongue twister right there. Still a good friend. And Ursula, though, was now facing issues. Just like in Capitol Hill, she didn't have a lot of friends, and also a pretty reserved person. It was pretty hard for her to make friends. And where she really found socialization, where to have fun with others, was actually at the church. But John Burroughs did not really believe in organized religion or the church as a whole. He would take Ursula there and would not stay with her, actually go down to the forests to actually look at birds and record sightings. And then once church was over, would come back, pick up Ursula, and take her home. So not really spending time together. Now, I wish I had a better photo or a younger photo. If the gentleman to the left of John Burroughs, that is Julian, and that is his son. Now, to give some context on John Burroughs' child, Julian came about because of an issue, as Ursula Burroughs had issues having children. There were fertility issues. Doctors at the time had eventually said, Ursula, you might want to look into adoption as an option. And Ursula was fine with that. And so on July 1st, 1878, John Burroughs actually walked home to Riverby with a baby in his arms, and that was Julian. Just imagine, gentleman to the left, a lot younger. Now, Julian did serve to bring John and Ursula together as an emotional bond they could share. They both loved Julian with all their hearts. The issue is, though, that when Julian was 8, he came home crying from the school, and John asked, "What's going on? Why are you sobbing?" Well, that's because the children had said, "Julian, I think your dad is your dad. You look a little too similar. I think your dad cheated on your mom." And Julian was heartbroken. Is this true, Dad? Well, it was. As John Burroughs was always cheating on his wife. The thing is, though, actually had a child with Amanda Hennion, who was a maid at Riverby. And at Riverby, there were maids all the time. There's a very high turnover rate, and it was not because of Ursula's cleanliness, as John would even joke about how if the cat walked into the home, it had to wipe its paws before going inside. But it was just because John Burroughs was making romantic ventures or trying to hit on the staff, which Ursula never appreciated. Now, John Burroughs did pay for Amanda's health care and actually adopted her child, which was Julian, and Amanda was paid off by John to leave the area and never lay claim to Julian as her child, which worked out for the better. The thing is, though, Ursula was heartbroken initially, as she'd always been hoping for a child, and the one child they have is biologically not hers, but actually is John's. But eventually she would grow past this issue and would accept Julian as her child. As even Julian later on in life would say, I only had one mother, and that was Ursula, his mom. But also during this time, John would actually go to Canada for a few months just to get out of the area, just to let everything cool down. And also, real quick, a little funny moment and a little tension in the family, which John had an issue with. The fact is, Christmas was never celebrated in the Burroughs home, not by John, and Julie would cry every Christmas over not getting presents. And that's because John, a bit of a generational trauma, John's Burrough Chauncey thought Christmas is a holy day, so you'd only read the Bible and study and rest, not so much for having presents. And John, as a young boy, would actually put up stockings in the family home, hoping Santa would give him presents. Well, in the morning, he would wake up and there'd be frozen horse manure in his stocking. So sadly, that trauma carried later on, and John never celebrated Christmas with the family, even though Ursula said just give him some presents and enjoy the time of the season. Now, this photo of just farmers in the 1800s, I show this just because America is changing. As the Industrial Revolution is now hitting the United States, a lot of family farms are now collapsing as young people, their children, are actually going to work at the factories, making more money. An example of which right here, and the script right here, as John Burroughs did publish more works at the time, Signs and Seasons. Americans were reading this as simply they can no longer see the fields and the forests. They can at least experience it through his writings. So his fame is escalating. And also, John Burroughs was making ends meet now. In 1886, actually quit his job as a federal bank examiner, and at his property actually opened a vineyard, was growing grapes that Julian, his son, would actually help take care of. He's making some more money. But also in the 1890s, with his books selling pretty well, he'd actually go on the lecture circuit from 1896 to 1897. He was paid about $150 a day. Now, John Burroughs despised this job, did not appreciate it in the slightest, thought it was a waste of time. He wanted to write, not to speak, but it was to help pay for Julian's tuition for his expenses to go to Harvard, which Julian would eventually go to and graduate from. Now, this is a photo of a Chicago school in the 1890s and gives a general idea of what I want to talk about, just simply how did John Burroughs become famous? As he was pretty popular, but this would skyrocket his fame, and people all around the world would know his name. That is because of a Chicago school teacher named Mary Burt, who in 1887 actually ordered some of John Burroughs' works, his books, to have the children read and learn from, as she saw that John Burroughs' writing was very simple, even a child could understand it. And these children, who could never really see the forest, could never see a clean river, and even then John would note later on in his writings that children, if they saw some deer or some fish, would actually hunt them just to feed their families. At least through his books, these children can experience a better world and a cleaner world outside the city. Now, 1888, it is a success. Mary Burt's work actually spreads all across the country. Public schools are teaching about John Burroughs, and nature movements are actually sparking all across the country, as planting trees, nature hikes, learning from John himself. The fact is, John Burroughs actually tutor, or in a sense, he would actually take classes from Vassar College, mainly women's nature clubs. He would take them through the woods. He would teach them how to weave baskets, how to plant trees, and identify bird calls. And the children did love him, as they said he was a Santa Claus, but loved the creepy crawlies. He liked the bugs, wasn't scared by them. Moving on. This home right here is Slabsides. This was built on the Burroughs property on November 25th, 1895, called as such because the slabs of wood that decorated the roof. A really rough home, also pretty small, but was meant as a writing room and a guest home, which I know John Burroughs' brother would actually stay there for a time, and also as a way for him to get away from his wife Ursula, as tensions were still high. The only reason they would spend time together was to take care of Julian, or eventually Julian's children, their grandchildren. And it was about 1.5 miles away from Riverby itself. Now, this photo, what's John doing here? Was actually a trip in 1899 to Alaska. John Burroughs was invited by E. Harriman, who was a railroad magnate, who his doctor had said, Harriman, you need to spend some time out of work, actually explore and relax. So E. Harriman decided to organize a scientific expedition to Alaska to record sightings, talk to the native people, and also sometimes hunt bears, Kodiak bears. Now, the initial crew was about 40, and with the ship's crew added was about 126 people. They went on the expedition. John Burroughs on the left was the historian of the group, would record all their sightings and eventually publish a book later on. And the gentleman to the right is John Muir, who is a geologist and actually the expert in the group on glaciers, which they're standing on right here. And also, John Muir was already famous at the time for establishing the national park system or helping it get established. Also, certainly Yellowstone had his hand in that. And they would be good friends the rest of their lives, John and John. Now, the expedition did actually meet Tlingit people that John Burroughs did actually record. It was a really nice time for all of them. And also, once again, they did hunt the Kodiak bears, which didn't happen too often. But a funny story was that John Burroughs was looking to hit on some women to make an advance on some of them. He was trying to get off the ship at a time because everybody was drinking. And also everybody was a lot smarter or like more formally educated than himself. So it kind of felt left out. But thankfully, John Muir pulled him to the side saying, get back on the boat. We're taking it further downriver. So John's still looking around, not being so faithful to Ursula. Now, a pretty good, important figure that John Burroughs met and spent time with is actually Teddy Roosevelt, gentleman to the right of John, big old mustache, the big old hat. And they did become friends in 1889, and they would be friends until Teddy Roosevelt's death in 1919. And John's first big trip with Teddy Roosevelt was actually to Yellowstone. John was not initially invited as a guest. He was, though, later on, just because Teddy Roosevelt got in trouble, as it was leaked to the press that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to go to Yellowstone just to hunt panthers. And the government was like, we built these national parks for preserving nature, not so you could hunt. But Teddy Roosevelt said, no, 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 I'm actually looking at nature, exploring its beauty. Even John here agrees with me. John, like, come on the trip. So it was a bit of a shield. But John Burroughs and Teddy Roosevelt did share the same ideas on nature, as Teddy Roosevelt saw certain predator species such as wolves or panthers as rogues and bandits. Simply hunt them. There's no reason they should be around. And John Burroughs agreed as simply to preserve the gentler species such as rabbits and deer that can't defend themselves, which doesn't really work, as nowadays we know about the circle of life and also how ecosystems prosper. The panthers and wolves, they're needed. But John Burroughs also had a differing view on poaching. He didn't really care about it in the first place, as Teddy Roosevelt's actions, his initial actions of poaching panthers, didn't really care about, because his view, everything dies in the end, so why stop it? And a little bit of an issue right there, but they did get over it. And the fact is, John Burroughs, these actions were not seen as poor during the time. But even then, later on, John Burroughs would be seen as a bit naive in terms of nature, as he thought it was a clear garden, very ordered, with just prey species. But in reality, nature is wild, it is vast, and also deadly. But during this expedition, John Burroughs got a little bit of wake-up call, as in Yellowstone, there are boiling lakes and steaming rivers. And John Burroughs was frightened at the time, thought it went against his view of nature, seen as maybe perhaps, I don't know the best word for it, like scary, hellish, just didn't agree with his worldview of nature being kind and clean and won't hurt you. But later on, Teddy Roosevelt would actually take his wife and go meet John Burroughs at Riverby, took the presidential yacht up there. It was a good trip for all, and also got John Burroughs' name back in the papers, as these visits throughout his friends throughout his life really boosted his career, as John Burroughs was simply making ends meet. As an example, during the Great Depression, he did not suffer just because he didn't really have any money in the bank, and a lot of food he had, he simply grew himself. Now, these gentlemen, this is On the Book War, which is a bit of a silly name, but I'll get into it. This occurred in 1903 between William J. Long on the left and Ernest Thompson Seton on the right, and John Burroughs himself, because John accused them in the papers of simply writing falsehoods about nature and lying to the public. It was more so against Long and not Seton, because for Long, he was writing children's books. William J. Long's defense was that animal behavior is so varied that you can't tell I'm lying or not. I'm not telling any falsehoods, which you can't really do that because also John Burroughs had friends such as Teddy Roosevelt. The president at the time actually wrote in defense of John Burroughs, saying, William J. Long, you're lying to the public and ruining these children's livelihood. They're ruining their childhoods, endangering them. Now, William J. Long, his career would tank, but Ernest Thompson Seton on the right, his career would actually rebound. He would switch to more scientific writings and actually telling the truth and not so much tales, and he would prosper. But Long, well, John, he tanked his career. And other authors at the time did critique this whole fight as a bit pointless. It was, in retrospect, the thing is, though, it got John's name back in the papers. And that means he's selling more books, more people talking about him. Now, this property right here is the Nest. This was built in it was built in 1902 on the Riverby property on John Burroughs' land. It was built for his son Julian, as on September 25th, 1902, Julian actually married Emily McKay. They would live in the Nest, and eventually John would give Julian the deed to the property, to the family farm as a whole, which Julian appreciated but didn't really want. He wanted to leave the area to explore and get a better career, but he would stick around for a while just to keep his family happy, or more so, keep his mother and father together, as even he knew the relationship was a little tense, a little frayed. Now, Julian would have three children, Elizabeth, Ursula, and John II. You'll see in a little bit. And by 1916, Julian would actually leave Riverby. He would go to work as a superintendent at Standard Oil. So leaving the farm behind, real shame, but doing better things with his life. Now, this photo I think is pretty nice. Actually shows the grandchildren and John Burroughs, big man with the white beard in the middle. I believe it's in New York around late 1900s, like not just before 1910, I believe. And now moving on. This lady in the left, well, she's not a ghost. That is Clara Barris, a key player in John Burroughs' life and also how we remember him today. Even though they met only through letters in May of 1901, they would become the best of friends. And Claire would actually she would actually be, I'm gonna say hired, but she became John's biographer and chief editor, going over his works, his writings, and collecting his history. She did have a good relationship with the Burroughs family. It was said Ursula would actually invite her to stay on the property. She would stay in the Nest once Julian left. But Clara was said to have a hunger to her, a hunger for John's fame, as unlike Ursula, who never really cared about John's writings, thought it was still a waste of time, wasn't really making money. Claire would actually gather every scrap of paper John ever wrote on, any of his diaries, texts, letters, and compile them and build up his image. And this got Clara some enemies, as she would actually bombard John Burroughs' friends, saying, do you have any of his letters? What do you know about him, his early life? Getting any information she can. Even bully John's son Julian for his father's diaries, which he never gave over to Clara, so sparked some conflict. As Julian later on would never like Clara, she's a bit too pushy. And also at the time, there were rumors, which sources vary, that Clara did have an affair with John. Thing is, though, only one book I read confirms this, but also John had cheated on his wife throughout his life, so a grain of salt, just take it as you will, it's your own personal opinion. Now, on John Burroughs, what is he doing? He's starting up a Model T. It's actually a gift from Henry Ford. As in 1912, Henry Ford got in touch with John Burroughs. As John had said, the Model T would be the death of America. It's destroying nature. And Henry Ford said, how about, do you want a car? Maybe change your mind. And John said, all right. So in 1913, actually got a Model T delivered to his property. The mechanic sent by Ford didn't get to teach John because John Burroughs didn't really care about the inner workings of the Model T. So the mechanic had to teach Julian how to take care of the car, how to start it, and also how to drive. And Julian would drive his father around for a time until John Burroughs finally got in the seat, and he would crash multiple times. It took him a few months to get the hang of things, properly driving the car around, but he would appreciate it. And also later on, when Henry Ford would come to Riverby, they would discuss bird watching. And also, Henry Ford was seen by John Burroughs as a natural aristocrat, one of the good rich people, which is because Henry Ford would give his wealth away and would fight for the common man. As also, John Burroughs, throughout his history, throughout his life, would never per se critique the rich, even though they were causing industrialization, the loss of nature. He would still say they're doing a common good, and also saw a Darwinistic view on social hierarchy as simply whoever is rich, that means they're succeeding, which means they won their lot in life. They're trying, which is kind of strange, but it's just how John viewed the world. Just a little bit of his character. But later on, 1913 in the fall, John Burroughs and Henry Ford, all the way on the right, would actually take a trip to Concord just to go around the area, go hiking, and also bird watching. So one of the first camping trips for John Burroughs. Now, 1914, things are changing. John Burroughs and Henry Ford head down south all the way to Fort Myers to meet Thomas Edison. Now, John Burroughs did appreciate coming down here to Fort Myers just because all the locals were amazed by him and would actually ask him for gardening tips, which even Thomas Edison, the gentleman in the white bandana in the Model T, would actually accept the tips on and say, John, any ideas how to help my plants grow? As Fort Myers, the Edison Ford Winter Estates nowadays, well, he's still growing food to sell to make ends meet. Because Edison, he was upper middle class at that, never per se rich. But the reason for this expedition down south was actually a trip to Big Cypress, the swamps of Florida, more so central Florida, which included John Burroughs, 3 guides, Henry Ford's family, and Thomas Edison's family. The trip only lasted about 3 days. That's because the puddles you can see actually they're driving through could be about 10 feet deep. There were panthers, bobcats, gators, and also snakes, which Clarence Ford was terrified of. But the trip, even though it was short, John Burroughs did love it, started warming up to Edison. As his opinion of Edison early on was very poor because he thought that Edison was actually taking away his business. As by now, John Burroughs is no longer, his writings coming out like far and few between. He's no longer on the lecture circuit, so any money he makes is from royalties. And with film coming out and movies, he thought children will stop reading my books, but instead watch movies. But John would warm up to Edison later on. So the films weren't that big of a hit on his fortunes, his fame. Now, 1916 is actually John Burroughs on the left, then Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone. Henry Ford did not join this expedition up north, which was to the Adirondack Mountains and the Catskills, basically near John Burroughs' home. And John Burroughs was beloved by the group. He was 10 years older than Edison, seen as the old man, the sage, or simply a teacher. Actually take them both aside to sides of the road, point out plants, sediments, and also birds, identify them by call and the color of their feathers. And John Burroughs did warm up to Edison even further because during this expedition, John Burroughs did follow the rules, and so did Edison, of not bathing, shaving, or actually sleeping in a warm bed. They would actually sleep outside, and any bathing they would do was simply with a bucket of water or going to the river. Now, Harvey Firestone sadly did not take to this well. Actually, during the trip, he went to a hotel downtown, actually stay in a warm bed, get a shave, and Thomas Edison would actually say, Harvey, you look like a dude, which antiquated term, changing over the years. But John Burroughs did warm up to Edison, became good friends. Now, 1918 is a trip down south, the Dixie trip. And this was an effort by Edison, Ford, and Firestone to expand their fame, and also for Ford getting more films in the South, as at the time it was pretty unexplored, still tension from the Civil War, and also the roads are all mostly unpaved, so a pretty rough ride. John Burroughs, though, did not appreciate this trip, even though it looks pretty fun, hanging on the water wheel right here. Wonder who helped him up there. That John did not like the Southern people, thought they were uneducated, a blank look in their eye, and the rough roads did not help his back or his excursions. Just because John Burroughs, once again, is 10 years older than Edison, his health is catching up to him. He's not doing so hot. At least right here, he's having fun. Now, 1919. It is time for glamping, not so much camping. As John Burroughs is old enough now that he says, I want warm food, a warm bed, and clean water. I'm not going to the river to bathe. I'm not cooking over a campfire. Somebody else can do that for me. So he decided that well, more so told Henry Ford this. So Henry Ford actually organized a 50-car convoy to go actually back up north of the Catskills. And there were chefs, there were staff, and also film crews there at the time. John Burroughs can now relax. And it's still camping more so just for the press. As these trips, while John kept going, they were good for his PR, good for his book sales, and also throwing his name out there and hanging out with his best friends, which just to the left of John is Edison, to the left of Edison, Firestone, and to the second to the right of John Burroughs would be Henry Ford, I believe. Now, 1920, things have changed. They're going back up to Yama Farms to actually John Burroughs' property, as John Burroughs is 83. He's not doing so hot. He's got a chest abscess. His mind is deteriorating. He's not feeling so good. And also, thankfully, though, the wives came back to visit. You can see, like, Edison's wife, Ford's wife, and Harvey's wife. Why there's no Ursula, we'll touch on in a little bit. But this is a final hurrah, a celebration of John Burroughs' life with his best friends. They did have fun camping, woodcutting, and also John Burroughs fed Edison, Ford, and Firestone in Slabsides, cooking steak over the fireplace, being a real man's man. But it's also, as everybody knows, it's kind of in their hearts that John doesn't have much time left to live, will even survive for another camping trip. And why John's health is failing, his mind is deteriorating, is just because that Ursula had passed away on March 6th, 1917 from colon cancer. She'd been suffering from cancer for years. They caught it too late. And Clara would help take care of Ursula, giving her pain pills at the home. The thing is, though, did Ursula appreciate this? Did she even like Clara? We don't know, because also Ursula slept about 22 hours out of the day because of the pain and the medication. And John Burroughs was on a trip in Cuba with Henry Ford, just because Clara and Henry had said, get out of the house, stop worrying about your wife, you need to relax. But in Cuba, he did get a telegram with the news of her passing. And she was buried in Tongor Cemetery in Olive Bridge, New York. It's actually the tombstone of Ursula. Now, John's view of Ursula was strange in his writings later on after her passing. He was heartbroken. He did not want her to die. The thing is, though, he also said he did not want to spend any time with her. The love was lost. The thing is, though, spending so many years with her, spending almost their entire lives, he had some affection for her, but not as a wife. A shame, but it is what happens. It is history. But to get back to the camping trip, to cheer John up, there's a woodcutting competition, see a photo of right here, between Henry Ford and John Burroughs. And John Burroughs actually won the competition, got a congratulations from Edison, a little handshake, as the youngsters can't even scratch us, which is what Edison said. And the press were there at the time to take the celebratory photo, which you see on the left. The thing is, though, this was for show. It was not a real competition, as John got a very thin birch tree, a sapling even, and Henry got a large yew tree. Henry wasn't supposed to win. It was celebrate John and give a highlight of his life, and one more time put his name back in the press. Now, on the decline. It's a shame, but he's 83 by 1920. His heart is failing him. He was stricken with grief from the death of his wife Ursula, and his mind is slipping. He's in the throes of what they might say being senile or dementia. So he sought to go to California to better his health and also for some better weather, better than the cold in New York. Of October of 1920 was actually the last time he saw his home Riverby. He would be escorted, in a sense, by Clara's niece and also his granddaughter. They would go to California, and I believe we're in California. It would be, let me look through my notes real quick. Don't have the location, shame in that. But he would actually go to the hospital in February of 1921, where the doctors actually helped with the abscess in his heart. But they said that John is simply old. His health is failing. He might want to start making his final preparations and getting his affairs in order. Now, heartbroken that he's passing away, that Ursula's niece and John Burroughs' granddaughter decided, Grandpa, or like friend of the family, like, let's go back home so he can at least pass away in Riverby. And John Burroughs did sadly pass away on the train ride, which here's the funeral, but he did pass away on March 29th at 2 a.m. And John Burroughs' last words were, "How far are we from home?" So John Burroughs is dead. His funeral was on April 2nd. And you can see the funeral right here, the procession. People from all around the world came to visit to pay their respects. Henry Ford even helped pay for the cars for the funeral, for the procession. And on April 3rd, on his birthday, he was buried on the family farm where he played as a boy. Now, to celebrate John Burroughs' life, though, there was an association, which the medal right here is the John Burroughs Association, originally the John Burroughs Memorial Association, created in 1926, presented by the Association for the Best Nature Writer, and the awards are still going on today. April 3rd, on his birthday, give out the medal. There are dozens of schools and structures all across the country named after John Burroughs. Even in California, he only spent a short time there, but his writings changed America's view on the nature, I believe, for the better. And also, he had friends all across the country, all across the world. People wanted to remember him. And also, he did write over 30 books and dozens of essays, which you can still read today. You still buy his text, and most of them are free online. This is actually a photo of Riverby. This is the Burroughs estate. It's now a National Historic Site, still visited today, west of the Hudson, around the Catskills. And I believe right here is a photo of celebrating John Burroughs' birthday. Staff member right there on the right photo, actually reading from his books, reading from his writings. So, still celebrating him. He's still world famous. People still talk about him today as the Santa Claus that changed America's view on nature, or a man who was cheating on his wife all the time. That's more history to him. Now, here are my digital sources. A lot of where I pretty much got all the photographs, and the fact that the henryford.org website has a lot of photographs. You want to go dive a bit more in depth. And right here are the texts, all about John Burroughs' life. And I would say the newer one was a bit more of the scandalous one from 1997, John Burroughs, The Sage of Slabsides, a bit more critical of his life. The thing is, though, there's a lot of books written about him. Read them all and produce your own opinion, because the last book was the one that more so dived into his affairs, which might be due to retrospect on history, more sources opening up, or simply the author's opinion. I'd like to thank you all. I'll keep saying it. Once again, thank you for showing up at my webinar, tuning in, and have a good rest of your day.